Hey everyone, welcome to the Incubator Podcast. I'm your co-host, Darren Boyd.
And this is Satbir Sran. Really excited to have all of you join us here today. We have a great topic with you, for you, I should say. It is, well, I think there might be an 800-pound gorilla in the room. We are, that is Kong. Kong is the leading API gateway and service mesh technology platform out there. And representing Kong, we are joined today by their SVP, Reza Shafii. Reza, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks, Satbir. Thanks, Darren. Looking forward to that conversation today.
So Reza, why don't we start with maybe you can give a little bit of your background. We've watched your career. We've watched all sorts of episodes of you on various mediums. We'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, how you came to be at Kong, what some of that background brings in terms of experience, and then we'll get into a little bit of the dynamics of the industry, which I think will be pretty exciting because so much has changed over the last, call it even 6 years. But maybe we can start with you and then we'll broaden it out.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So maybe I'll start from way back and I'll try to keep it short at the same time. I started my career, I think, when I was very young, in 14, 15, when I was a BBS system operator, built-in board system operator back then with modems and so on. And that's when I really started just falling in love with the idea of distribution. You know, what I realized is a computer by itself was really powerful, and I think we all sort of fell in love with computers as a whole, but network of computers with remote capabilities, the ability to go over the network just adds orders of magnitude to that, right? And from there, you know, I was at a company called BEA Systems, which I think sort of helped define the term middleware. And then I was at MuleSoft for 4 years, where we launched the API management layer at MuleSoft, and I helped bring that about onto a company called CoreOS, which was part of the sort of core companies that created or helped the sort of leading Kubernetes and where it is now. And then Red Hat for a bit, where I was part of the OpenShift team and VP of product there. And then for the last 5.5 years, I've been at Kong, the 500-pound, maybe 800-pound gorilla, as you said. And we are at Kong a full API lifecycle management company. We like to think of ourselves as the next generation API management company in terms of being born in the cloud native era, in the DevOps era. And then one last maybe fun fact, I wrote my first API in 1998. I still remember it because it was in IDL and Corba, and we did an API first approach back then.
Reza, as the SVP of product here at Kong, and given your background as you've just described it, and you've had the opportunity to really see this, I'll say, domain evolve over a large extended period of time. Where do you think the API management gateway domain is currently? What's changing out there for enterprises?
Yeah, maybe I think I'll take a slightly different tact in responding to that, because I think one of the things that I've noticed over this time, if you go back all the way to that time of Corba and IDL, right? Why were we looking at that? And you know, you were in a world where you had players like Iona and such that were sort of reinventing distributed computing. But what I find very fascinating about this industry is that the technology we choose, the architectures we choose, are often a reflection of the team dynamics and sort of the team topologies, so to say, right? And back then, even there was this concept of building blocks, which I think was being spearheaded by players like HP, which said, look, you need to create building blocks that talk to each other over, you know, Core by IDL back then, because you can focus each team's sort of focus on a specific set of capabilities. So it creates that separation of concern, right? And we always have seemed to couple remoting with separation of concern with team sort of organizational structure. And if you bring it from then all the way to now, or the last 5, 6, 7 years, where microservices have become a thing. In some ways, microservices are sort of the most advanced evolution. If you take that sort of lever and bring it all the way, right? It's like you say, couple remoting to the purest way you can couple team and maybe people responsibility. Microservices does that. So going back to your question around the industry, I think if you go from even the time of the mainframe all the way to now, we've just kept going and going with now how do we do that differently, right? How do we make sure that you provide different capabilities around protocols, different capabilities around decoupling the choice of technology behind the remoting interface, and so on. So we've become much, much, much better at it now, but that has been the quest. And probably we're going to become a lot better at it in 10 years even going forward.
Yeah, I don't know if it's Conway's law or whatever, but we're seeing a lot happen in the team topology space. We're seeing a lot happen in architectural changes, and a lot of our customers are placing a lot of emphasis on development activities, making it easy for the developer experience, et cetera. And with that, it seems to align very nicely with architectural shifts such as microservices, et cetera. So in that changing world, what has been happening with APIs in general? We've seen a lot of activity there, from everything from protocols that seem to be now enabling some of these large distributed, high throughput, low latency transactions. We've seen monetization start to really evolve. We're seeing a lot of pressures from security, et cetera. What do you see happening in the space in general from an API management perspective or lifecycle management perspective? And what is Kong bringing to some of that market potentially?
Yeah, I think APIs really had their big moment, one of their big moment, maybe 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, when suddenly mobile created this need to make sure that you have well-defined interfaces that you can build these different experiences on top. That's when REST APIs really became a thing, right? And there was this sort of what I call first generation API management that was all around the management of these sort of edge RESTful APIs for exposure to create mobile apps. What I find is fascinating is that, with containerization and with DevOps really taking hold, microservices came into play. And then suddenly the world of API management completely kind of changed, because now it's not just about this RESTful APIs. It's now about the sort of much finer grained components of your application behind the scene, having very different types of interfaces, gRPC, REST, GraphQL, and others being part of the mix. And now suddenly, how do you make sure you apply some of the same concept, but also different ones that are needed to this world, right? And then what is happening now, I find fascinating, is that a lot of these API calls, a big percentage of them, are becoming calls to AI LLM APIs, right? And so one of the challenges of our time now is how do you make sure that as a developer, you can easily call the existing set of APIs you have, you can create beautiful APIs for others to reuse, but then you leverage AI LLM the right way, which is through APIs.
So there's a lot to unpack with that one. This will be interesting. So before I go down the AI space, because I'm very interested, Kong's doing a lot of wonderful things in that space. Before we go down that path, one of the things that we run into a lot is the evolution of the team. So I want to come back to it too, just to expand on what we've seen. So we saw the DevOps movement, and it started putting a lot of, it's a bit of an abuse term, but cognitive load on the developers. And we saw certain patterns emerge as a result. And some of those patterns seem to usher in things like platform engineering in a more significant way. So a lot of our customers, we see platform engineering teams emerge, in which case some of that control comes back. Like, for example, instead of allowing all the developers to spin up their own Kubernetes clusters, it turns out that got really expensive and inconsistent. We see things like platform engineering pull some of that back. There's a lot more multi-tenancy. There's a lot, the advent of platform services seems to have evolved, and it seems to put a lot of stress on certain patterns. Things like just even working with Kubernetes was one thing, and this is something that Kong does very, very well natively, but now ushering a new multi-tenancy and all of the security parameters that happen with that. What are you seeing in the space in terms of platform engineering? Is that unique to our perspective? Do you see it happening across the board? And what kinds of pressures does that put on API management? Maybe in addition to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, platform engineering is near and dear to me because I find that well, a couple of reasons. One is we are now seeing this convergence of platform engineering and API management. They are becoming one and the same thing in many ways. We'll get to that in a second. But platform engineering has been for a long time now the way we have tried to sort of control the chaos of many different teams building stuff at the same time, while ensuring there is some guardrails and things are going in some kind of managed direction, right? That's what big organizations are struggling with since Cloud Foundry, since the past world, right? And I think you're right with Kubernetes. What happened is we had this moment where we looked at Kubernetes and everybody said, well, that's the platform, that's the deployment target. So let's give teams just full access to their own Kubernetes environment and or to kubectl. But then that ended up causing sort of bringing the abstraction layer way too low. And people suddenly started, everyone has to be a networking expert as soon as you do that, right? And or storage expert. So that did not work super well. And what is going on now, what I'm observing, is this next generation of platform teams where they're saying, look, the APIs are the sort of unit of the core unit of deployment. Let's make sure that teams have freedom in terms of choosing the type of language they want to build it, the architecture of the microservices. But when it comes to using APIs, let's make sure we allow them a way to access the latest, greatest of set of like APIs that are there so they can go faster and sort of contribute back to the toolbox, the set of APIs that they built so that others can potentially use them, but also that we have some control around it so that they're secure, high quality, reliable, all that stuff, right? And so that's why I think the modern platform teams are API teams. And I'm seeing that more and more and more. And the most successful of them are API teams. We can discuss the question of how Kubernetes and the backend infrastructure where the actual apps run separately. That's a fascinating question. There's interesting patterns emerging, but that API layer becomes so core to modern platform teams.
So Reza, with platform engineering teams, like you mentioned, are becoming more of API teams in a way, and supporting ultimately the developer experience. So where is Kong from a product roadmap really focused on enriching that API team dynamic for making it easier for both platform engineering to support their developer counterparts?
Yeah. So, one of the terms that comes up often in platform engineering is things golden paths, right? These journeys that are very well defined and just easy. And what we've been focused on is to create the set of tools that enable these golden paths. And one of our customers called it express lanes. I almost like that term better. Create these express lanes for API consumers and API providers. At the end of the story, you're either wearing one of those two hats as you're building apps. And what you want to have is very easy way to be able to create an API and make it available, make it happen in a way that it's secure, reliable, well documented, all that stuff. And then have a very easy way to go search what their existing APIs are. So what we are focused on at Kong is to make sure our customers have what they need to create these golden paths as express lanes, right? And the way we do that is through Kong Connect, our platform, which enables self-service access to different backends, to different API gateway instances, mesh instances in a single tenant and or multi-tenant way. You choose combination of single tenant and multi-tenant, which we can go there and talk about what that means. And also, in ways that, different companies, different organizations have different level of needs in terms of how much they want to host. versus how much they want us to host. So we provide that level of capability as well. But bottom line, we are building a platform for platform builders, modern platform builders.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I want to tag on one aspect of that because you mentioned it earlier. Is so platform engineers engineering teams as a whole now are all working to figure out how to leverage AI and those AI use cases. So what is that dynamic there, and how is Kong actually supporting that kind of pattern or journey or express lane?
Yeah. Well, what I think is interesting is first, AI. When I first started playing with ChatGPT, one thing I realized, this was like 2 years ago now. It's amazing how fast time goes. Um, Back then, if you remember, it was quite constrained in that whenever it needed new information, it would go, well, my model has been built in 2011. I can't do anything about this, right? Something like that. And when you asked it to do stuff like research something, it go, I don't know how to research stuff. I've got the information that was built using model. Or do stuff, it couldn't really do stuff, right? Like, can you book me my ticket? Or it couldn't book a ticket. Why is it that it couldn't do any of this stuff back then? I would argue it's because it couldn't access APIs, right? Because you get APIs to get new information, you get APIs to know what the weather is like, so you can enhance the response to your prompt, and you need to have APIs in order to book tickets and things like that, right? And even something like, now I can give prompts like research this topic and then give me stuff. Well, guess what's happening? It's actually making API calls and enhancing the model, right? So it's improving the model right on the fly. So APIs are core to AI, no matter what, in my mind, in that way. So it's if the LLM models are the brain, APIs are the limbs, right? So it can't happen without APIs, which is, I think, fascinating in this development of the API world that we're starting to discuss. They're becoming more critical. Now, where Kong helps right now is, the first product we created in this space, and there's more coming. I think there's a lot more opportunities for us to help this space. But the first one we created was what we noticed was actually that in order to use these LLMs, most of the applications being built, if not all of them, are using their APIs. And as they use these APIs, there's all sorts of needs for either the organization or for the teams themselves that come in that we can help them with by having an egress gateway in front, right? You start with, well, how do I make sure that the right models are used? If you think about these models, they have different strengths, right? So we can actually help route based on the content. We can have semantic understanding of the content prompt and map it to the right backend model. So you get the best model at any given time. You get into being able to meter based on tokens and use the models that are less expensive. You get into managing a single token for the access to developers. Because if every developer, just like any other API, Stripe is the same thing, Salesforce is the same thing. If every developer goes and gets their own token, well, they're gonna have full control over that. You want them to be accessed through and standard API portal. We can help that. And so what AI Gateway is, and we could talk about AI Gateway for about half an hour here at least. So I won't go further right now unless you want to talk about specific areas. But it basically allows you to do that, and it fits into that platform engineering aspect very well because it's another express lane for API consumption. It just happens to be a very specialized type of API consumption, and that's LLM APIs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that I don't know that we talked to a single customer that isn't thinking about how to control some of these aspects. Everything you just touched on, I think, are so important as people are going down this path. It's another example of how Kong is truly enabling the enterprise. And you're right. I think we should come back and really explore this. But one of the other areas I really like. So one, the performance you get from Kong is phenomenal. The developer experience is phenomenal. I was thinking as we were talking earlier, one of the things that we get into a lot these days is developing experience APIs. Our customers, even platform engineering, wants to abstract a lot of the bits and pieces behind them. And so we'll find domains, we'll turn around and they'll build their own experience API. Well, it turns out we still have to control it. We have to manage it. We have to secure it. We have to do all these pieces. And one of the things that I find happens often is when people are building anything in security, oftentimes they won't give the right tools to test and exercise the things that are being built. And I was just absolutely delighted when I stumbled across Insomnia. It's another example of what you're doing for the developers. Can you walk us through what Insomnia does, what it means, and how people are using it? Because again, we can talk about any of these subjects at length, but that's another great one that I've bumped into and love.
Very cool. Yes. So that's part of this shift left movement, right? That's really important nowadays, which is to say, look, as much as of uh, all of the sort of not only checks and balances, that's probably the wrong term, but as much as the empowerment we can do to the developer's lifecycle without getting in their way, the better, right? Because then you don't have this heavyweight platform model where everything is checked by the central team. I call it carrot-based governance, right? Which is you actually make it delightful for developers to do the right thing. So what Insomnia does is, I think for us, Insomnia fits into our general philosophy and principle because it is a developer tool designed for developer experience to be number one, right? So we looked at the sort of API consumption world, and we noticed that having a tool that is not heavyweight, that is not sort of becoming a drag, is becoming an area of pain and need. And Insomnia was our answer, right? So it's designed to be simple and to be really focusing on the core needs of I want to make a set of API calls or I want to build API tests and help accelerate your development. What I think is also super interesting is that Insomnia has something called INSO, which most people actually end up like just considering as a thing that just works. But I like to talk about INSO even more. INSO is the CLI, which all of the capabilities of Insomnia, let's say you write collections or you write a bunch of calls or tests, can be automated through INSO. So you can verify them at DevOps time. You can run them at DevOps time. You can take INSO and you can take an OpenAPI spec and generate Kong configuration, for example, which then can be applied to the right environment using that command line. So this automation is built into Insomnia, and I think that's quite exciting as well. So yeah, Insomnia is super exciting for us, and I don't know if you saw, but we also introduced AI Runner as part of Insomnia because one of the things that's difficult with LLMs is their latency can be quite high. And so AI Runner essentially allows you for caching while you're developing for all of your LLM calls.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, so building down the path of all good things that Kong has built or is building, Reza, can we talk about more of the service mesh side of things and where service mesh? Well, the concept's been out there for a while. How do you define service mesh, and how does Kong then adapt to it? And what do you see as the continued development and enablement of Kong as a product that enterprises really would espouse?
I want to add on that too, because this is something we see often, which is people are afraid of service mesh. There are a lot of, I'll say your competitors, they're heavy lifts, it seems. But Kong is something that we find gets a lot of great press on how much easier it is to deploy in some fashion. So maybe you can speak to that as well. I don't know if you take a different philosophy or a different approach, and I don't have enough of the comparatives, but we see a lot of traction with your service mesh relative to some other platforms. And I can't explain it, but maybe you can.
Yeah. So I remember when I first saw ever service mesh was actually back in 1998 as well, believe it or not. And that was through an Iona product. The name skips my mind right now, but there was an Iona product for this concept of put the logic beside the app rather than having sort of a gateway model. They didn't call it sidecar, but it was effectively a sidecar. Um, and then when I saw it again in 2000, I think 17, as kind of a Google push, with Istio, of course, was when I looked at it and I go, wow, this is awesome. Finally, with the sort of marriage of containers and Kubernetes and sidecar, you could have magic happen, right? Because the theory of it is everything is automated, so your sidecar is almost transparent, and so you inject logic beside the application without the application even knowing it, and therefore this whole mesh kind of has its own automated brain dynamics that just works, right? That was the promise. What ended up happening is somehow this became this huge level of complexities being added to it. And also customers who ended up using it, they realized this is just introducing a lot more, or maybe the better way of saying it, it's a lot more intrusive than they expected, right? Um, I remember I had a perfectly well-working Kubernetes cluster. I tried the service mesh back then, this CoreOS time, and then I had to delete my cluster because it just messed it up so much. I had to create a whole new cluster from scratch. I didn't know how to undo all the stuff it had done. And so that is, I think, what you're seeing as people going, wow, I'm afraid of this because it can be so intrusive. Now, what we've tried to do at Kong is to take the concepts and bring the power in a way that is less intrusive, in a way that is more operator friendly. That has been the underlying principle of Kong Mesh since the beginning. So have the power of a mesh both on Kubernetes and outside of Kubernetes, because another thing that mesh is assumed is that the world starts on Kubernetes and then you have a mesh on top of it, right? But most enterprises don't have Kubernetes, or they do, but there's a lot of things they have that are not Kubernetes. So how do you take those assets that are not Kubernetes and deal with that? So first, it works with Kubernetes and non-Kubernetes, and it tries to be much less intrusive and less operational complexity. That's what our aim is and our principle is around Kong Mesh here.
So there's and thank you for that. I do want to make sure I get this out as well. I saw your last conference, and one of the statements that came up on the screen was built by developers for developers. And I think as you listen to this podcast, I think that'll become very apparent. But you make a lot of commitments back to open source as well, right? When you were talking about Mesh, I was thinking about Kuma. Can you talk about maybe your philosophy around the open source movement and the importance of that to Kong as something you support, because it is really you are building this for developers, and that's something that's important to them as well. Any statements around your commitments as a company to open source?
Yeah, I'll say, look, I've seen multiple types of open source companies, and there are, roughly speaking, there are those that have it there and see it as a necessary evil. And there are those that really embrace it and learn from it and can improve using it, right? And when I was at CoreOS, I really understood that is very powerful, right? And when I saw Kong, I thought, wow, look, here's a company that has the Kong Gateway open source version, which a single person or a single team can take and be successful with it. And when they go to their needs being, no, I need a gateway for my org, well, suddenly we can do things that we do outside of open source that can help them. When they say things where I need to build a developer platform where we can leverage that and provide capabilities that are not open source on top of it. But let's help that individual developer, let's help that individual team with the open source core that is there, right? And so that's the general philosophy at Kong. You see it with Kong Gateway, you see it with Kuma underneath Mesh, and you see it with Insomnia. And that's how we think about it. To me, it's an extremely powerful model because each of those projects has thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of developers behind them. And we have the fortune and opportunity to be able to get their feedback and leverage it in building better product. right? And that's something you just can't get without open source.
It is funny you say that. I remember speaking with one executive who said, effectively, oh, I got to do this. I have to do open source. It's such a pain, but it's something we have to do. And so it's interesting. When you pointed it out, I immediately thought of that one person that I spoke with not too long ago.
Well, I remember an anecdote where a long time ago, where Microsoft was not the Microsoft it is today. There was a open source conference, and you had the Google person, you had the Microsoft person, and then the Google person introduced themselves, and then the Microsoft person's turn was, and he said, "I'm responsible for open source of Microsoft." And that's kind of like saying, "I'm responsible for evil at Google." And back then, of course, Google's thing was do no evil.
That is good.
Reza, as we draw to a close here, I want to shift the attention towards Kong as a company itself, right? We talked about Kong being the 800-pound gorilla, right? If it fits your logo, if you will. Kong has been on a journey, right, since 2000, being founded in 2009, the acquisition of Insomnia in 2019, I believe it was. And now you're a Series A, sorry, not Series A, Series E firm. What's next, both from a firm as well as a product roadmap perspective? Where are things heading from Kong?
Yeah. So from a company perspective, let's start there. We continue to focus on our end user and customer needs. So it's like we are evolving and growing at the pace we are, because I think part of our mantra, the core of mantra, is make sure we do things that make sense for our customers and user base. So you're going to see us to continue to do that, and Connect continues to be the platform to do that. And the way I think about Connect is what AWS is as a platform. Connect is to us, right? So you're going to be able to get Kong Gateway through Connect. You're going to be able to get API portal documentation capabilities, API observability. All of these will be core capabilities that are like the EC2 and the S3 and the ECS of Amazon. So we will provide more and more services on Connect for different users. And I think one thing that's really important to mention, we will do that with incremental buy-in model, right? We don't want to push a big platform that you have to adopt as a whole to our entire customer base. You can start one place, be successful, and then go and adopt other parts of it, right? So my sense is, if we continue to do that, we listen to our users, we leverage Connect as a platform to do that. Hopefully, we will continue to have a win-win and joint success journeys with partners like you and with customers that are ever growing.
Awesome, very compelling, Reza. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to working with Kong in the future here, very much so.
Yeah, thank you very much. You, your team, everyone's been delightful. Kong's an easy sell. It's got such a great reputation. And these are some of the reasons why. We will have to have you back, because there's so much more we want to get into. And you know what, even if we wait a short time, I'm sure there's going to be a laundry list of new capabilities. So we appreciate that and your dedication to the development community.
Thank you. Thank you. Great discussion, and looking forward to our partnership going forward. Thank you.